This One's Wife. Vanity Fair. What it tells us. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. You are probably aware that a detailed 8,000-word article has been published by Vanity Fair, that talks about this one's wife and Harry. The front cover suggests it's American Hustle, which hints at them being hustlers, grifters. The cover story is inside Prince Harry and this one's wife's big business ambitions 5 years after their royal exit. An Appeal writes the article, published by Vanity Fair. What does it tell us? Are there some interesting revelations within it? What as a whole does the piece explain? Well, it opens by stating the House proved it. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex could have it all. Their Monty Shit Show home offered all the fresh promises of a 21st century Californian mansion and the cloistering of a gated neighbourhood from which they could emerge on their own terms. In the house's 13 fireplaces, described as mostly centuries old, examples brought over from France, there was even some European history, stripped of any potentially uncomfortable context. At $14.65 million for more than 18,000 square feet, half the current median price per square foot in Monty Shit Show, Rockbridge was a steal. The oligarch owner's romantic relationship had deteriorated to the point where he was compelled to offload far below market value, according to a source with knowledge, and the property seemed just right for the Duke and Duchess. It was the perfect launchpad for Archwell, their non-profit and entertainment studio, an approximation of a part noblesse oblige, part aspiring independently wealthy mogul model, one that Elizabeth, Charles and William rejected by doing so in the January 2020 Sandringham Summit. This January marks 5 years since that failed parley. Leaving the royal family has brought tests for the couple, legal, financial, reputational, personal and practical. Going from divinely chosen, or at least chosen by someone else who was divinely chosen, members of a 1,200-year-old institution, to start-up founders in exile is a tough adjustment. But there's also been opportunity. Over many months, Vanity Fair spoke with dozens of people who have worked with and lived alongside the couple to understand the impact they've had on their new coastal California community, the challenges of enacting the ambitions of two first-time CEOs, and how their experience with the monarchy foreshadowed some of their current difficulties. Harry and this one's wife declined to be interviewed for this article. That's the introduction to it. That's the opening. And its two main points of note are they interviewed dozens of people. They've spoken to individuals. They've gathered the evidence. So this isn't a speculative puff piece that has been pumped out on behalf of this one's wife, nor is it a hack piece from a royal expert just speculating on what might be. It actually comes from a place of evidence. It's also interesting to note that Harry and this one's wife declined to be interviewed. Presumably the terms that were offered with regard to what they'd be asked about would naturally have been subconsciously threatening the need for control that this one's wife has, and therefore it was rejected. As I've explained to you on numerous occasions, you are never going to get this one's wife to submit to the difficult questions because they're too much of a threat to control. The real questions that people want answering, she's never ever going to allow those questions to be posed to her. Instead, it's only ever going to be on her terms, the soft soap interviews that you've come to witness so far. Now, as I mentioned, there's 8,000 words, and I'm not going to go through the entirety of the article. That'll take too long. But what I have done is stripped out, and there's a lot of them, the main fundamental points that arise from this. The article starts off by taking us back to the podcast when they had the contract with Spotify. We were told that the development process for Spotify was challenging. They wanted a big theme that would explain the world, but they actually had no ideas. which supports the fact that these two lack imagination, lack intelligence, and lack ability. Some of the ideas for the podcast included Harry and This One's Wife hosting and talking to interesting civilian guests. Harry came up with his "How did you become a sociopath" idea, which was described as a booking challenge. Basically, he was saying, my mum was in effect murdered and I turned out okay, matter of opinion, but why is it you, Donald Trump, and you, Vladimir Putin, and you, Mark Zuckerberg, have essentially turned into sociopaths? That was the idea that was touted. A suggestion was made to Harry that he would review hot chocolate each week, not the band, and he would chat with a friend. He rejected that, for once showing a good judgment. He also wanted to do a podcast about the disabled people who competed for Invictus, but that wasn't seen as having a wider audience. The article explains that Henry is seen as being very well-mannered, very polite, and that ultimately he didn't want to do the podcast. He was happier doing charity work and in effect would rather prefer that This One's Wife would do the earning. It mentions the Bill Simmons fucking grifters remark, that Archetypes wasn't actually This One's Wife's idea, that Archwell took so long to actually deliver something, Spotify had to bring in their own studio, Gimlet, to actually ensure that things moved. Archetypes was complicated as a podcast concept because it was about saying what someone was essentially accused of and then how they were not that very thing. It makes the point that they weren't archetypes, they were actually stereotypes. And it was assumed that This One's Wife would use her personal Rolodex to book people for the show, but that didn't really transpire. Taylor Swift was invited, declined. Beyoncé, surprisingly, wasn't she such a good pal of This One's Wife, was apparently asked and declined, and so Megan Thee Stallion similarly declined, demonstrating that This One's Wife is not the draw that she might think that she is. Apparently the episodes got more and more watered down. They didn't receive the full $20 million. This One's Wife exhibited idealization and devaluing behaviour in respect of people that she worked with, something that I've covered in the separate video, I Needed Therapy After Her. This One's Wife was described as a mean girl's teenager, but also by another person as a lovely, genuine person. Her bullying nature was evident. Working with her caused people to take a leave of absence and attend therapy. And that This One's Wife was described as a good person trying to do good things in spite of and because of unkind people. So that's what essentially came out of the article in relation to when they were working with Spotify. The focus then shifts more onto Harry, and the main points that arise from that are as follows. Spare chronicled his lonely former life with an MRI level of self-examination, but not always top-tier self-awareness. That Harry hadn't really absorbed the effect of him telling all in Spare about his family, that he didn't seem to appreciate, selling millions of copies where he airs the dirty laundry. He hadn't thought about how that would impact. Harry's lawsuits get mentioned. It's told that strangers take lifts, the ride-hailing service, to their house, which amounts to a security concern. That the security lawsuit was why Harry didn't actually attend the Grosvenor wedding last June, as it would have undermined his current court claim, although there are conflicting sources which suggest that he just wasn't invited. Harry's described as being socially marooned beyond his nuclear family, and that This One's Wife is actually upfront that he hasn't made many friends. This, of course, is that because he's been plucked from an environment that he knew well and been placed in one that he doesn't know well. And also, of course, as I've explained on many times to you before, This One's Wife keeps him isolated because then he's easier to control, and she doesn't care about him. The suggestion from the article is that Harry essentially just wants to be left alone. He just wants to do a bit of charity work, kissing the babies, etc. now and then, and not have to worry about money. He doesn't want to be famous the way that This One's Wife wants to be famous. It shows a rather entitled and naive view of the world, but it also shows that the main driver of the behaviours comes from This One's Wife. The article suggests that Harry doesn't understand himself and he doesn't understand a monarchy. What comes out of this is essentially that Harry's not such a bad chap. He's rather naive, not very clever, and in essence, largely wants a quiet life and tries to protect his family. The article moves on to the relationship and says that they're deeply in love, that they're so hot for each other. It may well be the case that Harry does love his wife, although recent appearances would start to suggest that something has gone wrong there. And as you know, this one's wife is incapable of loving anybody because she has no emotional empathy. The article explains that when Harry flies solo, he's much more personable. When he's in public with this one's wife, he's more protective, more agitated, because people are so nasty to her. Parallels are drawn in relation to Diana. It's described that this one's wife is the caregiver and the facilitator in their dynamic, missing the point that she's actually the controller. And the article, quoting somebody, suggests it's not an Oedipus thing, but she's reparenting him, which is a fair observation and does link to the manner by which she controls him. The article talks about how it's easy to imagine a folie à deux, something I've mentioned in a video just recently, and that you don't tell them no. There is some cynicism exhibited in the article about her not knowing anything about Harry before and not knowing about curtsying and so forth. One person is quoted as saying, "This one's wife is the type of woman who would check a menu out online before going to a restaurant. An individual is actually named and therefore pours scorn on the suggestion that she didn't know things." Also, there's scepticism about her complaint that she was forced to wear neutral colours whilst involved in the royal family, given the fact that now her wardrobe is principally composed of that palette, the Duchess of Industrial Beige. The article explains they managed to showcase their charisma to great effect in their reimagining of the monarchy when they attended the faux royal tours in Nigeria and Colombia. But there's confusion in terms of what they're actually representing compared to, say, an actual royal tour or a celebrity working for an organisation, and Angelina Jolie is given as an example in that respect. It's stated they haven't achieved independence from the palace, they haven't established a track record in philanthropy yet through Archwell, yet they still continue to use the titles, and, as was the case in Colombia, this one's wife allowed a young girl to curtsy to her, so there is the suggestion once again of having their cake and eating it vis-à-vis the monarchy. It's also pointed out that people were originally instructed to call them Sir or Madam, but then this was later dropped. It also points out that there was a missed opportunity with regard to making use of this one's wife as an asset concerning the Commonwealth. It then turns to Life in Monty Shit Show, and it goes on to list a number of celebrities that live there and have managed to do so peacefully and quietly without causing any kind of ruckus or brouhaha. That these individuals have moved there and they live there quietly so that people who are not famous would just greet them with a hello in the local coffee shop and no more. Natalie Portman, Jeff Bridges, John Carradine, Kirk and Michael Douglas, Jonathan Winters, Gwyneth Paltrow, Adam Levine, Jimmy Connors, T.C. Boyle, Leonardo DiCaprio, Neil Young and Daryl Hannah, Michael Keaton and Oprah are all mentioned as celebrities who've peacefully coexisted with other locals in Monty Shit Show. An individual is quoted, referred to as the Monty Seaton, who says that they're described as the prince and the starlet, and they're seen as local villains. They've been part of this increasing house prices, out-of-towners coming in, driving too fast, taking up street parking. The person states that they've not actually met this one's wife or Harry, not seen them around, nor has this person's friends, pointing out that essentially they're not really seen. American Riviera Orchard gets mentioned in the article. A resident says that she's trying to monetize something and is bringing more attention to a place where the Sussexes say they want to be left alone, outlining the hypocrisy. They're described as the most entitled, disingenuous people on the planet. They are described as hypocrites with regard to the issue of privacy, and that they try to cherry-pick fame or wanting the good side of it whilst rejecting the bad side of it. Our Road's trademark problems are mentioned. A source says that this one's wife actually does work hard. There's mention of her touting a potential divorce book, which I've talked about separately in the video, The Inevitable Divorce Book. Apparently, it states that this one's wife wants to make the world a better place, and that caused her to reach out to Jamila Jamil and Chrissy Teigen and Omid Scobie, offering solace even though she's not close to them, as you know. This has been the case as a consequence of facade management and her narcissism. It talks about how they, in essence, bless people with their royalness, again, utilising something which they're meant to have left behind. The article suggests that they don't know what change the world actually means. They want to be seen as people who want to change the world, and suggests this is why she keeps on banging on about the Procter & Gamble tale. Essentially, it states, in conclusion, to point out the modesty of that world bettering feels like contributing to the essential problem of Harry and this one's wife. No matter what they do, they just can't win. If Harry's burden is a soft oppression of no expectations, this one's wife might be the opposite, the betrayal of not living up to an unachievable ideal. I think the whole world was waiting for her to be that person, and then she never jumped, the source who worked in media says. Diana walked amongst landmines. This one's wife couldn't even say the word slut. So it ends with an unfavourable comparison in relation to Diana. What does this tell us overall? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's clearly based upon information that has been obtained. Vanity Fair will be mindful of the potential of being sued by the litigious gruesome twosome. So, like the Hollywood Reporter, they've got their ducks in the row in terms of evidence. It's a balanced piece overall. On the one hand, it demonstrates aspects that confirm the unpleasantness of this one's wife, the failure to do things, the hypocrisies, the way that they're seen by certain people, but also suggests that there were missed opportunities with regard to utilising her in relation to the Commonwealth, that she's a genuine kind person, that she's hard-working. And what it does do, of course, is demonstrate how different people will have different experiences of this one's wife depending on what she shows you by virtue of being the chameleon that is the narcissist. The article doesn't explain that, I do. But overall, it seeks to be balanced. It's not a hit piece, and nor is it a puff piece. It does provide some interesting insights, but I think the overall takeaway that comes from it is that an organ such as Vanity Fair, to go into such detail about them, whilst of course not going into the controversial areas about the moon bumps and the children, etc., because likely they're not able to come up with the evidence to support things in that regard. But overall, have sought to essentially assess where have the Sussexes got to in the last 5 years, and that they provide a sort of 5-year report in that regard, which suggests they're kind of floundering around trying to stand for something without really understanding what they do stand for, that they've met with some successes with some people, but also they've caused problems. It's not an article that's there to puff them up, and it's not an article that's to knock them down. It strikes me as a balanced appraisal, which of course fails to take into account her narcissism, as they invariably do, but is interesting nevertheless. What are your views about this Vanity Fair article? Let me know in the comments section. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.